The fires had burned for 47 days across the surface of Nine. The people watched their world die piece by piece as the Dominion tore through their defenses like claws through paper. Their fleet was gone. Their armies were broken. Their hope had vanished long ago. Stood on the balcony of a shattered building and looked up at the orange sky filled with smoke and the distant shapes of enemy warships. She was young by standards, barely past her second growth cycle, and she had already seen more death than her grandparents had witnessed in their entire lives. The capital city around her was nothing but ruins now. The beautiful crystal towers that once caught the light of their twin suns lay in fragments across the streets. Elder had broadcast the final message 3 days ago. He told all across the galaxy to remember their home. He told them to carry the memory of Nine in their hearts because soon it would exist only in memory. The Galactic Council had officially declared their world a lost cause. Every allied species had withdrawn their forces. The mathematics of war did not favor and the Council always followed the mathematics. The blockade surrounded the planet with over 200 warships. Their ground forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The remaining defenders were less than 8% of their original strength. There was nothing left to do but wait for the end. Heard her mother calling from inside the shelter, but she did not move. She wanted to see the sky one last time before the came. She wanted to remember what it looked like when it was not filled with enemy ships. Then she saw something strange. Bright streaks appeared in the upper atmosphere. They burned white and gold as they fell through the clouds of smoke. Counted 12 of them, falling in a pattern that seemed almost controlled. She assumed they were weapons at first. Perhaps they had grown tired of waiting and decided to end things quickly. But the streaks did not explode when they hit the ground. They crashed into the ruins at the edge of the city with tremendous force, throwing up clouds of dust and debris. Watched with confusion as the dust began to settle. 30,000 light-years away, the message had arrived at Earth Defense Command exactly 11 days earlier. It was a simple distress call, broadcast on every frequency that could reach. They asked for help. They said they were dying. They said anyone who could hear them should know that the Dominion showed no mercy. Admiral stood before the assembled commanders and read the message aloud. When she finished, the room was silent. Everyone knew what the Galactic Council had decided. Everyone knew the odds were impossible. Everyone knew that sending forces to Nine was suicide. Commander Hayes raised her hand and asked a single question. She asked how long it would take to get there. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Earth would respond. They could not save but they could stand with them. They could show the galaxy that humans did not abandon those who asked for help. Hayes led the Rapid Response Unit. She had served for 18 years and had fought in 7 different conflicts across 3 star systems. She had never led a mission with 0 probability of success before. When she briefed her soldiers, she did not lie to them. She told them they were probably going to die. She told them the enemy outnumbered them by factors she did not want to calculate. She told them the Galactic Council thought they were insane. Then she asked who wanted to volunteer. Every single soldier stepped forward. The 12 dropships launched from Earth's carrier group at the edge of the system. They used experimental stealth technology that had never been tested in combat. They entered the atmosphere at angles that would kill the crew of any other species. Human bodies could survive forces that would crush bones or rupture organs. It was one of the few advantages they had. Sergeant Danny Cole felt his vision go dark as the dropship screamed through the atmosphere. The heat shields glowed white. The hull groaned under stresses it was never designed to handle. He had made combat drops before, but nothing like this. When the ship finally crashed into the surface, the impact threw him against his restraints hard enough to crack 2 ribs. He did not complain. He was alive. Commander Hayes was the first one out of her ship. She stepped into the ruins of an alien city she had never seen before to defend a people she had never met. Behind her, 600 human soldiers began unloading equipment and setting up defensive positions. They worked with quiet efficiency despite the chaos around them. Watched from her balcony as strange creatures emerged from the crashed vessels. They walked on 2 legs but they were smaller and softer looking. They wore armor that seemed primitive compared to technology. They carried weapons that looked almost handmade. She ran to tell her mother what she had seen. Within an hour, the first scouts made contact with the human forces. They approached with caution, not understanding who these newcomers were or why they had come. Corporal Maria Santos was the first to speak to them. She used a translation device that struggled with grammar but managed to convey the basic message. "We are humans from Earth. We received your distress call. We are here to help." The scouts did not believe her at first. They asked how many ships had come. They asked where the fleet was. When Maria told them there were only 12 drop ships and 600 soldiers, they thought the translation device was malfunctioning. No species would send only 600 soldiers against the Dominion. No species would fly through a blockade of 200 warships for a world the Galactic Council had already abandoned. It made no sense. Private Park finished setting up the communication array as night fell over the ruined city. The orange sky faded to black, and the distant flashes of weapons lit up the horizon. The enemy would know they were here soon. The battle would begin in hours. Commander Hayes stood at the edge of their defensive perimeter and looked out at the destruction. Somewhere out there, millions of civilians were hiding and waiting to die. She turned to Danny Cole and gave him his orders. They would hold this position until reinforcements arrived or until they were all dead. Those were the only two options. Danny nodded and checked his weapon. His broken ribs ached with every breath, but he did not mention it. There was work to do. The humans had arrived on 9. Hope had been gone for 47 days. Now, for the first time since the invasion began, something other than despair stirred in the hearts of those who watched the sky. 3 days had passed since the humans fell from the sky. They had not yet launched a major assault against their position, but everyone knew it was coming. Commander was gathering his forces on the eastern edge of the city. His scouts had reported the presence of the strange new species, and he wanted to understand what he was dealing with before he crushed them. Elder walked through the ruined streets toward the human defensive zone. He was old and tired, and his legs ached from the journey, but he needed to see these creatures for himself. The reports from his scouts made no sense to him. 600 soldiers against 40,000 ground troops was not a military operation. It was mass suicide. Commander Hayes met him at the perimeter. She stood straight despite the exhaustion visible in her eyes. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a time since they landed. There was too much to do. Studied her face and tried to understand what he was seeing. Humans looked fragile compared to most species in the galaxy. Their skin was soft. Their bodies lacked natural armor or weapons. Yet here they were, building fortifications in a war zone that every other species had abandoned. He asked her the question that had been burning in his mind since he heard of their arrival. He asked why they came here to die. Considered her answer carefully. She knew they operated on logic and probability like most Galactic Council species. She knew they would not understand human reasoning easily. She told him that humans did not abandon those who asked for help. She said it was not about probability or logic. She said some things were worth fighting for even when winning was impossible. Shook his head slowly. He explained that the Galactic Council made decisions based on mathematics. Resources were limited. Sending forces to a lost cause meant those forces could not be used elsewhere. It was simple efficiency. Smiled at him. She told him that humans were not very good at efficiency. While they talked, Sergeant Danny Cole was leading a team of 12 soldiers through the ruins on the eastern side of the city. The sun had set hours ago, and the darkness was nearly complete. They could not see well in low light conditions. They relied heavily on their heat-sensing organs. Humans had neither advantage, but they had something else. They had night vision equipment and decades of experience fighting in the dark. Danny moved silently through the rubble with his team close behind him. Specialist Amy Torres carried the heavy demolition charges. Lieutenant Greg Palmer coordinated their movements through hand signals. They had done this kind of operation many times before on different worlds against different enemies. The supply depot was poorly guarded. Commander had not expected anyone to attack his rear positions. His forces outnumbered the humans by ridiculous margins. No rational species would attempt an offensive action in their situation. Danny and his team were not feeling particularly rational. They slipped past the perimeter guards and planted charges on the fuel storage containers. They rigged explosives in the ammunition bunkers. They moved like shadows through the camp while soldiers slept or stood watch facing the wrong direction. When the charges detonated, the explosion lit up the night sky for miles. Secondary explosions continued for 20 minutes as the fire spread through the depot. Danny watched from a safe distance as weeks of supplies burned to ash. The counterattack came within the hour. Soldiers poured into the eastern ruins searching for the attackers. They found Danny's team waiting for them in prepared positions. The firefight lasted for 3 hours. Danny took a plasma burn across his shoulder that would have killed instantly. He kept fighting. 2 of his soldiers received wounds that would have sent soldiers to medical facilities for days. They kept fighting. When they finally to the main defensive zone, they had killed over 200 enemy soldiers and suffered only 4 wounded. None of the wounded stopped to rest. Corporal Maria Santos worked through the night treating injuries. She had trained as a combat medic on Earth and had served in field hospitals on 3 different worlds. She had never worked under conditions like this before. There were not enough supplies. There were not enough beds. There were not enough hands to help. She found 3 children hiding in a collapsed shelter 2 blocks from the perimeter. They were alone and terrified. Their parents had died in an earlier bombardment. Maria did not hesitate. She picked up the smallest child and carried all 3 of them back to safety through streets where snipers had been spotted earlier that day. Watched from the shelter as the human woman brought the children inside. She saw the blood on Maria's uniform from treating wounded soldiers. She saw the exhaustion in Maria's movements. She saw Maria immediately begin caring for the frightened children despite everything else she had to do. This was not how war worked. Had been taught that war was about resources and territory and power. Species fought to gain advantages or to protect their interests. What the humans were doing made no sense by those standards. Commander received reports of the night raid and the failed counterattack with growing frustration. He had underestimated these creatures. They fought without regard for their own safety. They continued functioning with injuries that should have incapacitated them. Their tactics were unpredictable and aggressive in ways his training had not prepared him for. He sent a message to his superiors in the blockade fleet. He told them the new species was more dangerous than initial assessments suggested. He requested additional ground forces. He recommended updating their tactical databases with information about human combat behavior. The response came quickly. His superiors told him to stop wasting their time. He had 40,000 soldiers against 600. They told him to eliminate the humans and finish the conquest of 9 as planned. Did not argue, he began planning his assault. Back at the human perimeter, Commander Hayes met with Greg Palmer to discuss their next moves. They could not hold their current position forever. They needed to expand their defensive zone to protect more civilians. They needed to find better ground for the battle that was coming. Greg suggested using the underground tunnel system that ran beneath the city. They had abandoned it as indefensible, but he believed humans could operate there effectively. It would negate some of the enemy's numerical advantage. Agreed. She gave orders to begin exploring the tunnels at first light. Across the city, in the main civilian shelter, Elder sat alone and thought about what he had witnessed over the past 3 days. 600 humans were doing what millions of Galactic Council soldiers had refused to do. They were fighting for them when no one else would. He did not understand their logic. He did not understand their motivation. But for the first time in 47 days, he felt something other than despair. He felt something that might have been hope. 2 weeks had passed since the humans arrived on 9. The defensive zone had expanded to cover nearly 12 square blocks of the ruined city. Over 50,000 civilians now sheltered behind human lines. The impossible had become reality, and it was spreading. Captain Victor Nash brought his supply ship through the blockade on the 8th day. He lost 2 escort vessels in the attempt, but he delivered 300 additional soldiers and enough equipment to sustain operations for another month. 2 more supply runs followed over the next 6 days. Human numbers rose to 900. 900 against 40,000. The odds were still ridiculous, but they were slightly less ridiculous than before. Lieutenant Greg Palmer stood in the entrance to the underground tunnel system and studied the darkness ahead. They had built these passages centuries ago to connect different parts of their city. They had abandoned them when the invasion began because the tunnels were too narrow for their defensive equipment and too dark for their limited night vision. For humans, the tunnels were perfect. Greg led the first exploration team into the darkness. They mapped passage after passage, finding connections that spread beneath the entire city. Some tunnels had collapsed during the bombardment, but most remained intact. By the end of the 3rd day, they had identified 17 different routes that could be used to move soldiers behind enemy lines without detection. Sergeant Danny Cole was eager to put the tunnels to use. His shoulder had healed enough for him to return to active duty, though Dr. Ruth told him he should rest for another week. Danny ignored her advice. There was too much fighting to be done. His first tunnel operation was a complete success. He led a team of 20 soldiers through a passage that emerged behind artillery position. They destroyed 4 heavy guns and killed 50 enemy soldiers before withdrawing through the same route they had used to approach. The Never saw them coming. Commander received reports of the attack with growing rage. His forces were being humiliated by a species the galaxy had never even heard of before this war. His superiors in the blockade fleet were beginning to question his competence. He decided to end the human resistance once and for all. The assault came at dawn on the 15th day. Committed 8,000 soldiers to a direct attack on the human perimeter. He expected to overwhelm them through sheer numbers. He was wrong. The humans had spent 2 weeks preparing for this attack. They had fortified every approach. They had rigged the streets with improvised explosives. They had created kill zones where advancing soldiers would be caught in crossfire from multiple positions. They had done everything possible to multiply their limited numbers. The first wave of soldiers walked directly into the trap. Explosions tore through their ranks before they reached the first defensive line. Gunfire erupted from windows and rooftops and barricades. Soldiers who tried to take cover found themselves exposed to fire from unexpected angles. The advance stalled within minutes. Private Park monitored enemy communications from his position in the command bunker. He heard officers screaming for reinforcements. He heard soldiers reporting impossible losses. He heard confusion spreading through the enemy ranks like a disease. He reported everything to Commander Hayes, who adjusted their defenses accordingly. The battle lasted for 7 hours. The through wave after wave of soldiers against the human positions. Each wave broke against the defenses like water against stone. By the time finally ordered a retreat, he had lost over 2,000 soldiers. Human casualties were 18 dead and 43 wounded. The news spread through the population like wildfire. The humans had held against an enemy force that outnumbered them almost 10 to 1. They had inflicted catastrophic losses while suffering minimal casualties themselves. It seemed impossible, but it had happened. Approached Corporal Maria Santos after the battle and asked if she could help. She was young, but she knew the city better than any human ever could. She knew the streets and the buildings and the shortcuts that only locals would recognize. She wanted to do something more than hide and wait. Maria brought her to Commander Hayes, who listened to her offer and considered it carefully. Using a civilian as a scout carried risks, but the intelligence she could provide was invaluable. Assigned to work with Greg Palmer's reconnaissance teams. Subcommander was the first military officer to officially join the human forces. He brought with him 37 surviving soldiers from his unit and offered their service. He told Hayes that if the humans were going to fight for his people, the least his people could do was fight alongside them. More followed over the next few days. Some were former soldiers. Some were civilians who had never held a weapon before. The humans trained them all, teaching them tactics and techniques that the Galactic Council had never developed. Elder watched the changes with amazement. His people had been defeated and demoralized for nearly 2 months. Now they were beginning to fight again. The humans had given them something that no amount of military force could provide. They had given them hope. Park intercepted a critical communication on the evening of the 15th day. The fleet was requesting additional forces from their home system. They reported that the conquest of 9 was taking longer than expected due to unexpected resistance. They did not mention the humans by name, but the implication was clear. The humans were not just surviving, they were winning. Commander publicly executed 3 of his subordinate officers for their failure during the assault. He blamed them for the losses and promised his superiors that the next attack would be different. He began planning a new offensive that would use twice as many soldiers. Back at the human perimeter, Commander Hayes held a briefing for her senior officers. They had won a significant victory, but they could not afford to be overconfident. The enemy still outnumbered them by enormous margins. Reinforcements from the home system could arrive within weeks. Time was not on their side. She explained that their goal was not to win the war. Their goal was to hold long enough for something to change. Maybe the Galactic Council would reconsider its position. Maybe other species would be inspired by their example. Maybe Earth would find a way to send more help. Until then, they would fight. They would protect the civilians who had trusted them. They would not surrender or retreat or give up. That was what it meant to be human. Across the galaxy, news of the battle on Nine was beginning to spread. Species that had abandoned the herd reports of humans holding against impossible odds. Governments that had calculated the mathematics of defeat were forced to reconsider their calculations. Something was changing. It was small and uncertain and fragile, but it was real. Hope was no longer gone from Nine. 5 weeks had passed since the humans landed on Nine. The defensive zone now protected over 100,000 civilians. Human forces had grown to 900 soldiers supported by nearly 2,000 volunteers. Against them stood an enemy that had just received massive reinforcements. The Dominion had doubled their ground forces. 80,000 soldiers now surrounded the human position. Their commanders announced that they would make an example of the humans to discourage any other species from interfering in conquests. They promised total annihilation. Commander had been replaced after his failures. The new commander, General, was known throughout the Dominion for his brutality and effectiveness. He studied the human tactics carefully before launching his assault. He would not make the same mistakes his predecessor had made. The attack began before dawn on the 37th day. Sent his forces in from 5 directions simultaneously. He used heavy artillery to destroy the human fortifications before his infantry advanced. He deployed specialized units to seal the tunnel entrances the humans had been using for their raids. He committed everything to this single overwhelming assault. The human defenses began to crack within the first hour. Sergeant Danny Cole led the defense of the eastern sector. He watched his soldiers fall one by one as they pushed forward through the rubble. He took a plasma bolt to his leg that burned through muscle and bone. He kept fighting from a sitting position, unable to stand. When they finally breached his section of the line, Danny grabbed a wounded soldier and dragged him back toward the secondary positions. He refused to leave anyone behind, even though every movement sent waves of agony through his shattered leg. Corporal Maria Santos worked in the field hospital as the casualties poured in. She had run out of proper medical supplies hours ago. She was using torn clothing for bandages and alcohol from the food stores to clean wounds. Her hands were covered in blood that belonged to a dozen different soldiers. A volunteer brought her water and asked if she needed rest. Maria shook her head and kept working. There would be time to rest when the battle was over, one way or another. The fighting continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Human positions fell and were retaken and fell again. The defensive zone shrank block by block as the advance continued. Commander Hayes stood in the command bunker and tracked the battle on a holographic display that flickered with damage. She had lost 112 soldiers already, with over 200 more wounded. Nearly a third of her force was now out of action. The mathematics were turning against them. Elder found her there and made an offer. He said the humans had done more than anyone had a right to expect. He said they could evacuate now while there was still time. They would cover their retreat. They would remember what the humans had done for them. Looked at him for a long moment before responding. She told him that humans did not leave until everyone who wanted to leave was safe. She said they would hold this position until every civilian was evacuated or until there were no humans left to fight. Did not understand her logic, but he finally understood her heart. He left the bunker to organize the civilian evacuation. Across the galaxy, the Galactic Council was meeting to discuss the situation on Nine. The reports from the planet had shocked many of the member species. A tiny force of humans was holding against the entire military machine. They were dying, but they were not surrendering. 3 species announced they would send humanitarian aid to Nine despite the blockade. 2 others began preparing military forces for possible intervention. The mathematics that had seemed so clear 6 weeks ago now appeared uncertain. Admiral received her orders on the 38th day. Earth Defense Command had assembled a relief fleet of 27 warships. It was the largest force humanity had ever deployed outside their home system. They were sending everything they could spare. Studied the tactical data with grim determination. The blockade numbered over 200 ships. Her fleet was outnumbered nearly 8-1. Any rational assessment would call this mission suicide. She ordered her fleet to advance anyway. The human ships entered the system at maximum speed, broadcast a message on all frequencies, ensuring they would hear every word. She identified herself and her fleet. She stated their purpose. She told the commander that Earth did not abandon its people or its allies. High Commander received her message with contempt. He ordered his fleet to intercept and destroy the human vessels. He did not believe such a small force could threaten his blockade. On the surface, the battle had reached its critical point. Forces had pushed the humans back to their final defensive line. Beyond that line lay the main civilian shelters where 200,000 waited for evacuation. Lieutenant led her fighter squadron against the atmospheric support craft. She lost 4 pilots in the first engagement but destroyed 11 enemy vessels. When her own fighter took critical damage, she aimed it at a troop transport and ejected at the last possible moment. The transport crashed with over 300 soldiers aboard. Danny Cole had been moved to the field hospital, where Maria Santos worked desperately to save his leg. He kept asking about his soldiers, about the battle, about whether they were holding. Maria told him to shut up and let her work. Commander Hayes walked the final defensive line as darkness fell. She spoke to every soldier she passed. She thanked them for their service. She told them she was proud to fight alongside them. She did not promise them victory or survival. She simply told them the truth about what they were fighting for. The assault resumed at midnight. Threw his remaining forces against the human positions in one final push. He expected to break through before dawn. Above the planet, Admiral's fleet engaged the blockade. The battle was desperate and violent. Human ships exploded under concentrated fire. Vessels shattered as human weapons found their targets. The space around 9 filled with debris and fire. Watched the tactical display and saw an opening. The flagship had moved forward to direct the battle personally. Its shields were weakened from earlier exchanges. If she could destroy it, the enemy formation might collapse. She gave the order to concentrate all fire on the flagship. On the ground, the human defensive line bent but did not break. Soldiers fought hand to hand when their weapons ran out of ammunition. Volunteers stood alongside human veterans and held their positions. The night filled with screams and explosions and the sounds of desperate combat. Hayes took a wound to her side during a breakthrough. She kept fighting until the breach was sealed, then allowed a medic to treat her while she continued directing the defense. The evacuation transports began launching from the hidden landing zone behind the defensive line. Each ship carried thousands of civilians to safety. Each launch represented lives saved by human sacrifice. As dawn approached, something unexpected happened. 4 warships appeared at the edge of the system. They were not human. They were one of the Galactic Council species that had voted to abandon 6 weeks ago. Their commander broadcast a message to both fleets. He said they had watched the humans fight for a people that were not their own. He said they were ashamed of their earlier decision. He said they had come to stand with the humans. More ships arrived behind them, destroyers, colony defense vessels that had somehow survived the initial invasion. Species that had calculated the mathematics of defeat were now recalculating. The universe was changing, and the humans had changed it. The battle above 9 had transformed into something no one had predicted. Admiral watched her tactical display as more Allied ships arrived to join the fight. The blockade, once so overwhelming, was now facing a combined fleet that grew stronger by the hour. High Commander saw his advantage slipping away. He had expected to crush a small human fleet and finish the conquest of a dying world. Instead, he found himself fighting a coalition that had formed around the humans like armor around a heart. Ordered her damaged ships to fall back and let the fresh arrivals take the lead. She had lost 9 vessels in the initial engagement. Her remaining 18 ships were battered and low on ammunition, but they had done what they came to do. They had broken the blockade. On the surface, General received reports of the space battle with growing alarm. His supply lines were threatened. His reinforcements might not arrive. The humans he had been ordered to annihilate were still fighting despite everything he had thrown at them. He ordered one final assault at dawn. Every soldier he had left would charge the human positions simultaneously. They would overwhelm the defenders through pure numbers or die trying. Commander Hayes received word of the approaching attack and made her decision. She ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate with the civilians. Only combat troops would remain on the line. Every soldier who could hold a weapon would stand and fight. Danny Cole refused evacuation. He had lost his leg below the knee, but he could still shoot. Maria Santos strapped him to a support frame that allowed him to stand upright and placed him in a defensive position overlooking the main approach. He thanked her and loaded his weapon. The charge began as the sun rose over the ruined city. 20,000 soldiers advanced across open ground toward the human positions. Artillery fire crashed around them, but they did not stop. They had been told this was their final chance to destroy the enemy. They believed it. Lieutenant Greg Palmer commanded the center section of the line. He watched the enemy advance through his scope and felt a strange calm settle over him. This was what he had trained for his entire career. This was the moment that would define everything. He gave the order to fire. The human line erupted with weapons fire. Soldiers fell by the hundreds, but more kept coming. They climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades and pushed forward. Some reached the barricades and began fighting hand to hand with the defenders. Specialist Amy Torres held her section alone after both soldiers beside her were killed. She fought with her rifle until it jammed, then with her sidearm until it ran empty, then with a combat knife she had carried since basic training. When a soldier finally knocked her down, she pulled a grenade and took him with her. The line bent, positions fell, soldiers died. But the line did not break. Led the remnants of her fighter squadron against the ground support craft. She had 3 pilots left out of 12. They attacked targets that outnumbered them 20-1, drawing enemy fire away from the ground troops below. When her fighter took critical damage for the second time, she did not eject. She aimed her dying craft at a command vehicle and rode it down. The explosion killed the general commanding the Eastern assault. His forces fell into confusion without orders. Above the planet, the Allied fleet finally broke through the blockade. Human ships led the charge, their damaged hulls held together by emergency repairs and determination. Behind them came cruisers and destroyers and vessels from half a dozen other species. High Commander watched his flagship's shields fail under concentrated fire. He had a choice to make. He could fight to the death and take as many enemies as possible with him, or he could retreat and preserve his remaining forces. He chose retreat. His surviving ships broke formation and fled toward the edge of the system. The Allied fleet pursued them until they jumped to faster-than-light travel and disappeared. The blockade that had held 9 prisoners for 2 months was finally gone. On the ground, General received word of the fleet's retreat. He looked at his tactical display and saw the truth. His army was being destroyed. His support was gone. His mission had failed. He ordered a general withdrawal. The soldiers broke off their assault and began retreating from the city. Some abandoned their weapons in their haste to escape. Others fought desperate rearguard actions as human forces pursued them. Hayes watched them go from her position on the defensive line. She was wounded in 3 places and had not slept in over 40 hours. She had watched friends die beside her. She had ordered young soldiers into battles they would not survive. But they had won. The evacuation transports continued launching throughout the day. By nightfall, over 200,000 civilians had been transported to safety. The ones who chose to stay began emerging from their shelters to see what remained of their city. Found Corporal Maria Santos sitting alone in the ruins of the field hospital. The medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded had been moved to the evacuation ships. Maria was staring at her hands, still stained with blood that would not wash away. Sat beside her and said nothing. There were no words for what had happened here. There was only silence and survival and the slow return of hope. 347 human soldiers died in the defense of 9. Their names were recorded and transmitted back to Earth, where families received the news with grief and pride. Elder addressed the Galactic Council 1 week after the battle. He stood before representatives of 100 different species and described what the humans had done. He told them about soldiers who fought with wounds that should have killed them. He told them about medics who worked until they collapsed. He told them about a species that had traveled 30,000 light years to die for strangers. He asked the council why no other species had come. The silence that followed his question lasted for a very long time. In the weeks after the battle, 6 species formally requested alliance status with Earth. 12 others began diplomatic negotiations. The Galactic Council voted to establish a permanent human observer mission. The mathematics of galactic politics had changed forever. Traveled to Earth 3 months later as part of the first diplomatic delegation. She visited the memorial that had been built for the soldiers who died on her world. She read their names carved in stone and remembered the strangers who had become heroes. A human woman approached her at the memorial. She was older, with gray in her hair and grief in her eyes. She introduced herself as the mother of Amy Tors, told her what her daughter had done. She described the bravery and the sacrifice and the final moment when Amy chose to save her fellow soldiers instead of herself. She said they would remember Amy Tors forever. The woman cried and cried with her. Commander Hayes retired from active service 6 months after the battle. Her wounds had healed, but the memories remained. She spent her days answering letters from families who wanted to thank her for saving their loved ones. Danny Cole received a prosthetic leg and returned to duty. He trained the 1st Joint Human Military Unit and led them in operations against raiders for another decade. Maria Santos became the head of humanitarian medicine at Earth Defense Command. She developed new protocols for treating alien species based on her experience on 9. The final memorial ceremony was held on the anniversary of the landing. Representatives from 37 species attended. A diplomat spoke the closing words. "When we had lost all hope," she said, "your warriors fell from the sky. They fought for us when no one else would. They died for us when no one else would. We will never forget what humanity gave us." She paused and looked at the assembled humans. "You gave us hope.